Hello, everyone, and welcome to the top of the hour for hour 23. Joining us today is Sean Gordon from Israel. Sean is a patient in adult polyglucoscan body disease, or APBD. APBD is a late onset, slowly progressive disorder affecting the central and peripheral nervous systems, presenting from the mid-40s onward. And APBD causes decreased walking ability and other symptoms, and ultimately was causing Sean to leave his career and focus his energies on general rare disease advocacy efforts, as well as APBD advocacy efforts in Israel, where he currently resides. So please welcome Sean from Israel. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff, and appreciate you giving us the time this morning or afternoon or wherever we are. It's here in Israel. It's 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I have no idea where it is with everybody else, but anyways, thank you for the time today. I want to give you just an overview of the rare disease world here in Israel. Pretty active world, and it's where I've lived here for 32 years, and just want to go through our presentation. In any case, where are the slides going? Jeff, you can help me. Oh, here we go. So I'll give a quick outline on our presentation. So I'll give you sort of just an overview of the genetic disease situation in Israel, which is kind of unique, actually. Number two, the governmental strategy. And number three, the shareholder analysis, what's happening on the ground here in Israel. So I'll give you a little overview of what's happening here, just to give you sort of demographics and the facts of which color the rare disease community here in Israel. Israel is not a massive country. We're about 9 million people. 74% are Jewish, 21% are Arab, and by the way, Arab can be Muslim or Christian. We'll get into that, what that means. And 49% are sort of other kinds of religions. The life expectancy in Israel is 82.7 years, which is a little on the high side in the OECD countries. The ratio of doctors to population is 4.8. Now, I brought this up because I think it's relevant. We talk about how rare disease is being treated in Israel. And then in terms of the rare disease population, there is no, like most countries, an exact figure, but we were using the normal number of percentage of the population. So it's about 500,000 people, which is really quite a large number of people, and you really don't. Because of, again, like unfortunately most countries, it's underreported or not reported at all. There's a lot of people that are probably suffering that aren't. In fact, I was one of them. We can talk about that a little later. I was actually a sufferer too, and it took me many years to get a diagnosis. The government, just give you a little impression about the government. The government here guarantees health for everybody. There's a law passed in '85 that guarantees health for everybody. The government is positive to supporting rare diseases, and we'll talk about that later. But very interesting is the government here in Israel has a very liberal, I might call a liberal, compassionate use doctrine. As far as I understand the United States, only if you're just about to die will they look at giving you the right to a compassionate use drug. Here, death is not the only requirement. Diminished capacity of your own, basically you have a less capability of living your life is also an option for compassionate use, which is really great because a lot of entities are used that as a way of sort of doing early trials for the rare disease drugs. And lastly, we have pre-marriage genetic testing is very, very common. So these are things that kind of give you an idea about the rare disease community here in Israel. Now, as I mentioned, so that kind of got weird. So Israel has a very interesting genetic makeup. Israel is sort of divided into three large, very big, or two big buckets with many sub buckets. The two big buckets there's a Jewish community. That Jewish community was basically living out of Israel for probably 2 centuries, for 2,000 years. And then you have an Arab community. The Arab community here is a combination of people from the indigenous people who lived here for many also hundreds and maybe thousands of years, and also many people who came from outside, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, and Egypt. So they brought their genetic strains. Within each of these big buckets, you have several sub buckets. Within the Jewish community, you have Jews that came from two distinct geographical areas. The one was from Europe, and they had lived there for depending on who you talk to, a couple thousand years. And then you had the Jews coming from the Middle Eastern countries who maybe even predated that. They may have come from close to 3,000 years. So these communities were geographically separated for millennia, and they rarely mixed. Therefore, each of them develops their own genetic diseases among them. In the Arab community, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the Arab communities also have their own they very, very rarely married out of their own communities, and oftentimes very consanguinical or cousin marriages are rather common. So therefore, both the groups, the Jewish group and the Arabic group, kept their genetic diseases. Fortunately or unfortunately, kept their genetic diseases sort of within the family. So therefore, we have a tremendous number of genetic diseases here in Israel that come from families. So in terms of the common genetic disease among Jewish European origin, there are numerous diseases, and I'm actually a patient of one of these diseases. I have a disease called, as Jeff said, APPD, which is a disease which is in the family of glycogen storage diseases. And one of those diseases, and that one of those sub branches of that, there are five different diseases, which is I have. Is I poorly metabolize glycogen, and because of that, it creates certain problems certain problems. And one of them is I produce a substance called polyglucoside, which is rather toxic for nerves, and that's the disease I have. So that's, and I sort of won't go through all of these diseases, but it just gives you a flavor that there's quite a number of genetic diseases among the Jews of European origin. Now, that is beginning to change in Israel, because now, whereas Jews in Europe rarely ever left Europe because it was obviously the distance was impossible. They didn't have boats were very, very difficult. So the Jews of Europe sort of stayed in the European world for 2,000 years. Only after they established the state of Israel in the beginning of the 20th century did Jews leave Europe, and so they kept the genetic disease really in Europe. Even more so, Jews within, as like was very common for most of humanity, they rarely left their own little villages, or their towns. So they rarely mixed. When the Jews from Poland rarely mixed the Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and vice versa. So because of that, they kept their diseases. Now, cousin marriages, while the Torah or the Bible allows for it, was as a practical matter rarely happened. Generally, people married their second cousins. That was much more common. The first cousin, it's not prohibited in Jewish law, but just as a practical matter, not that common. So one of the big again among the buckets of Jews in Europe, the Jews and the people in Israel are Jews, and a subset of them, about 40% of the Jewish population in Israel is Jews of European origin. The next group is there's among the Jews you have the major bucket is Jews. Then you have one group Jews of European origin. The other group is Jews of Middle Eastern origin. Now that group is about 60% of the Israeli population, and they have a number of different their own genetic diseases they have in Israel. Now we'll talk about how that's been trying to be controlled through genetic testing, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. But the Jews of the Africa, they come from North Africa. They come from North Africa is common. The Arabic lands, like it's not so much Saudi Arabia, but a lot of it came from Yemen and the southern part of the South Arabian Peninsula. Iran and Iraq were very common. These were very common places the Jewish people came from, and they brought together. They've been lived together for thousands. They've been living in those countries. I mean, in many cases, since 500 years before the birth of Christ, they were living in Iraq or Iran or Yemen, these different places. And they rarely, again, just like again we said about the European Jews, they rarely left their own areas, and they almost never married non-Jews. So they kept these diseases sort of in the family. Again, while marriages are not prohibited, they just as a practical matter were that common. So again, we have numerous number of diseases in the Sephardic or North African Jewish community. The next big bucket, as I mentioned, so you have the bucket we have of the okay, trying to get to the next slide here. That was one bucket was the Jewish bucket, and they've split into two: of the Jews of European heritage and Jews of the Jews of the North African heritage. The next group is the Arab population. The Arab population splits into two, which is not well known here, but the Jews the Arab population split in sort of two and a half ways. One large group is obviously the Muslim population of Israel, and that's and that group constitutes a large percentage of the non-Jewish or Arab population. The other group are the Christian Arabs, and they have. But what's interesting about these two different communities is they rarely. There are examples, but it's very common for them not to marry to go across from the Muslim to the Christian. I know I have a personal friend they grew up as Christian and married a Muslim man, but that's less common. But in earlier generations, it was very common. Was that marry their cousins, so they would stay in their small communities. So they would marry their relatives, which obviously expands the number of genetic defects because they're certainly passing it between or among the family. As you can see from the slide, there are a numerous number of just genetic diseases that the Arab population in Israel has, and it's because of the intermarriage, or not the intermarriage, but because they don't marry out of their families. Again, it's changing because people are becoming more modern. But needless to say, this is a very common feature of the Israeli life. So we have a sort of a huge challenge here in Israel because whereas in other countries we are as it were trying to dilute out these genetic defects. Here in Israel, we're only exacerbating them. Now, as before, in the Arab community, there's much more openness today. People are not marrying only their own families. And number two, in the Jewish community, people of the Sephardic heritage are marrying Ashkenazi and vice versa. So therefore, those autosomal diseases that require a father and a mother having the same, being a carrier, obviously when people marry across their subgroups, i.e. when the Jews of European heritage marry the Jews of the Sephardic or Middle Eastern heritage, you get fewer genetic defects coming from them. So it's a matter of just sort of practical changing in lifestyle that's happening. So I want to show you the next one is so we have this sort of significant genetic. We have this genetic sort of challenge happening in Israel. What is Israeli government trying to do about it? So one of the big things the government started doing, and this cuts across Arabs and Jews, is pre-marriage genetic testing. So the government of Israel understands that if you can try to, if you can counsel people about their genetic background, it would be then easier later on, rather than having children, or at least understand the challenges the couple has. So therefore, the government of Israel essentially pays for for genetic testing. They don't offload it to the health funds because health funds just wouldn't pay for it. So therefore, the slide says, so in a population-specific screening that includes all non-severe diseases and relatively frequent in a specific population with a very high carrier frequency. So the government of Israel is trying to ameliorate the problems of rare diseases before they become let's say a child is born. Number two, the government does subsidize or pays for these very, very expensive genetic these treatments. So before they actually paid for, in the past, they paid for for drugs for Pompe disease, which was very, very expensive, 150,000 euros per person. I have a friend of mine who didn't have a rare disease, but he had a rare form of cancer, and it was extraordinarily expensive to pay for that medication, and the government paid. And I have another personal friend of mine who has Gaucher's disease, and the government, and that's another common disease on European Jews, and the government was happy to pay for that. So that's another part of the strategy the government tried to pursue. Then there also the government understands here that people have many challenges, and therefore there are specialized clinics for people with rare disease and or their children, or either children themselves, and those clinics are not only in the center of the country but also spread out to the periphery of the country, where actually quite a lot of people with rare diseases live. The more traditional communities, both among the Jews and among the Arabs, don't live in the center. So therefore, they put these specialized clinics farther south and north of the country where the people live. But now we're trying to we're going to discuss what I would call the stakeholder analysis. So first, the stakeholders are the research organizations. I'm not going to go through each of them, but I will tell you that Israel is a very scientific-minded country, and there's quite a lot of science and technology happening here in Israel. Probably among the hottest places in the world for startup companies. And that also extends to biological companies and pharmaceutical companies we'll talk about in a moment. So the rare disease research is quite active, and I'm not going to go through each of these, but there's a number of sites with deep knowledge in the area of research in genetics and rare diseases. Our group here is actually working with one of the groups in Israel. They're helping us pursue a treatment option. So therefore, very, very active in the area of biological research in general, and rare disease in particular. And you can see, you may be able to see that the country has numerous activities, which goes part and parcel with the general scientific orientation of Israel. As you may know or may not know, Israel, is quite well represented in the Nobel Prize. Just a couple of years ago, we had a very well-known woman who won the Nobel Prize in crystallography, which really helps you understand the makeup of genes. So we have a very active committee in general for research. The next area is the next shareholder. The next stakeholder would be pharma, and we have the big pharma. Well, not big for the United States or European, but big for Israel. We have big pharmaceutical companies, which is just a partial list. Each of these pursue rare disease drugs. Then we have numerous startups, and these are just a few of them. A few of the startups, and many times they're founded. Some of these startups are founded by people with just one. They're looking for a solution for one particular rare disease, and they create a company for that. And these are some of these smaller companies. So we have a very, very active pharmaceutical, very active pharmaceutical rare disease community in Israel. So number one, we have on the research side. Number two, we have on the pharma side. And number three, in terms of stakeholders, so we have the government, we have research, we have pharma. Now we have the rare disease advocacy, and probably not as active for advocacy community as in the United States or Europe is. but still, we still have a pretty active community here in Israel. We have a general organization called Eton. Eton sort of is an umbrella organization, and it really tries to help find volunteers. And we have very many disease-specific advocacy groups. And this here, I belong to the last one. I'm sorry, there was adult inclusive by disease Israel. There's an American group, and we're in the Israel group. We work together with them, and then a number of diseases. Obviously, each of these diseases have analogs in other countries, but they work. They have a specific group in Israel, and obviously, language is a problem because Israelis, many Israelis, well, they may speak English, but they don't feel comfortable with English, so we have to create obviously local advocacy groups to help them both work together with the specific challenges of the government here in Israel and the resources here in Israel. But number two, help them connect with the bigger community in English. Then we have some sort of I would call umbrella groups that help disabled people in general. And some of these people are going to will have rare disease, and some will have some people through other kinds of diseases, war accidents. So those organizations are, I would call them they take care of the world of handicapped people in general. So these are the sort of I would say to give you again a sort of very quick overview to which a very complex community here of rare disease. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Jeff, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, you can email me, call me, whatever. I'm happy to answer questions. If you want to get involved with the Israeli rare disease community, again, I'd be happy to connect you. That's my talk for today.
Thank you, Sean. That was awesome. I appreciate you taking the time this morning, and I know we're going to have you back on stage here in just a couple of hours for the day one presentation. You talking about being a dad with a rare disease and how it affected your life. You mentioned that obviously Israel is a really technology forward thinking country. And you talked about a lot of the different organizations and a lot of the complexity. If you had to pick one thing, though, what do you think is one of the greatest challenges that the community is facing now from the rare disease viewpoint?
I think that Israelis are difficult. They love organizations, but I think a lot of different people here in Israel are not well connected like in other countries. I think the Americans are much better organizing the rare disease communities, and I think that here they're less good at that than I think the United States. I think unfortunately, Jeff, a lot of the Israeli rare disease patients, and I would include myself in that group, again have challenges despite all the awareness on the genetic testing, which I didn't have before I was diagnosed, it's very difficult still with very very small disease groups to get good diagnoses, good diagnoses. I was misdiagnosed for many years, but I think that's still a challenge. I think language is a big challenge because a lot of the rare disease international stuff, even this conference, for instance, would be my guys in my Israeli group really could participate in this conference. They just don't know English that well. Maybe one or two guys do. But it's not. So I think language is another very big challenge that the community has.
All right, thank you. The next question was, you talked about genetic screening. With that, has there been any talk, and you might have addressed this in your talk as well, but what about newborn screening in the community? Would that make a difference?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I know that for instance, premarital screening is common. We have 4 children who've been married, or one is about to be married, and 3 of them were married. Each of them had a pre-marriage screening. Interesting, what they do is they give each party gets screened, or it takes there's a panel of 7 or 8 common diseases, and then they each take the test, and they don't know, all they know is they're compatible or not compatible. They don't know precisely which one they have their problems with. So that is not uncommon, the pre-marriage screening, but post infant screening, no, I haven't seen that. I mean, it could be true, I just don't know.
All right. Well, Sean, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Great to see you. Awesome topic. Great coverage for what's going on in Israel. So looking forward to your presentation here in a couple of hours, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate you and your wife really going all out to put this big program out. It's amazing. I can imagine it's an enormous task, and I think you're doing a great service to the worldwide rare disease community by doing this, and by also connecting us. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for the compliment.
Pleasure.
All right.
I'll send the invoice after. I'll send the invoice later.
That sounds awesome. So at the top of the hour, we're getting ready to hit our last hour of the 24-hour of rare portion of this, and we will be featuring France, Italy, and Spain to wrap up the 24-hour part. So hope everybody can join us. Sean, thank you again, and we will talk to you soon.
You betcha. Thank you. Bye.